Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Have you ever met someone who simply mocks faith, who laughs at Jesus' miracles and disbelieves everything he can't see with his own eyes? People who say that none of this is real, that paralyzed people walk, blind people see, and that it's all just lies, exaggerated stories. Well, today, here at Unknown Stories of Jesus, you will experience a miracle so grand that only an unknown outsider witnessed it. Something that challenges everything we know about faith and the impossible. Jesus' secret miracle that an outside witnessed. It's not just another story. What happened here defies all human logic and all medicine. Imagine an arrogant young man who not only mocked Jesus' teachings, but also disbelieved all the miracles he witnessed. For him, it was all a farce. Nothing could change his mind. He didn't believe until the day he was forced to believe. Now tell me, what if this happened to you? If a miracle so great, so impossible to deny, happened before your eyes? Would you accept that there is something bigger, or would you try to find a logical explanation? Because sometimes God chooses to prove his existence in unexpected ways. And that's exactly what happens in this story. Now close your eyes and try to visualize. Evening falls on Capernaum. The air is thick, filled with murmurs and expectation. The heat of the day still hangs on the stone floor, while torches flicker in the narrow streets. A crowd gathers. Some murmur, others wait in silence, but among them there is someone different, an outsider, a man who came from far away, who carries in his eyes the skepticism of someone who only believes in what he can touch, measure, and sell. He has heard of Jesus. But for him, these stories are nothing more than exaggerations of a people desperate for hope. He didn't come looking for a cure. He did not come to hear words of faith. But that day, the stranger saw something, a miracle that he could never explain, something that would change his life forever. Miracles like this cannot be found anywhere. Stories like this about Jesus' miracles have been lost in time and are rarely told. But here, in Unknown Stories of Jesus, each story is a door to the impossible, to the divine, to something that can transform the way you see faith. I know this story is already touching you, because deep down, everyone has experienced a moment of doubt. Everyone has wanted to see something bigger. The outsider in this story is not just a man from the past. He represents those who seek answers, those who want to understand the inexplicable. Just like him, you are also faced with something that could change your vision forever. So leave your like now, because this message will reach other people who, like you, know that there is something beyond what the eyes can see. And subscribe to the channel, because here is the only place where forgotten miracles are told again. Because that afternoon, with the sun gilding the stone streets of Capernaum, a stranger saw the impossible happen. And it all started with a simple look. And what happened next? You're about to find out. The sun shone high over Capernaum, casting an intense gold color over the stone streets and making the heat vibrate in the air. The village, located on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, was a vibrant center of commerce and fishermen. The sound of seagulls echoed between the mud houses, mixing with the noise of the waves gently breaking on the shore, and the constant buzz of vendors vying for customers' attention. The smell of freshly caught fish hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of spices from distant lands. Stalls selling dates, figs and pomegranates colored the busy streets, while merchants offered rare fabrics and perfumes to Roman soldiers and the region's wealthy merchants. Children ran among the customers, laughing and playing, while women balanced clay jugs on their heads, walking with dexterity. The city was alive, noisy, intense, but something different was in the air that afternoon. In the midst of the constant flow of people, a man walked with firm but calculated steps. His sharp gaze analyzed everything around him. Eliab, a merchant from Tyre and Sidon, He was not like the peasants and fishermen there. His clothes were more refined, his posture was haughty, his manner showed that he was used to negotiating with the richest. His fine linen cloak contrasted with the simple clothes of the people. He carried small leather bags filled with valuable spices and resins, which could be sold for good prices in larger cities. But despite its sophisticated appearance, Eliab did not carry faith in his heart. For him, miracles were popular exaggerations, beliefs of a people in need. His mind was practical. He believed in what he could count, weigh, sell. The only truth he knew was profit. Everything else was illusion. He had already heard of Jesus of Nazareth. Impossible not to hear. His name ran through the markets and roads like fire through dry straw. Some said he was a prophet, others said he was a powerful healer. But what bothered Eliab most was hearing those who claimed that he was the Son of God himself. A man called the Son of God? For Eliab, this was dangerous. He had already seen what happens when men gain too many followers. Revolts break out, empires are challenged, and the Romans did not tolerate disorder. Commerce suffered when faith became stronger than money, but something intrigued him. Unlike so many others who sought fame, Jesus didn't seem to want riches. He didn't demand payment. He didn't negotiate power. And yet, crowds followed him. Why? It was then that Eliab noticed something strange in the air. The movement of the city was not the same. There was less shouting from salespeople, less arguing over prices. The buzz was not of business, but of murmurs. People whispered to each other, and little by little the crowd began to change direction. Their gazes turned to the same point. Eliab frowned. What was happening? "He's here," muttered one of the merchants at the side, pausing from a negotiation to look ahead. "Who?" Eliab asked, even though he already knew the answer. The man turned his head slowly, as if he didn't believe the question was real. His gaze carried something between astonishment and admiration. "Jesus." Eliab let out a short sigh, looking away. It was always that name. Since arriving in Capernaum, he had heard that name countless times. Jesus did this, Jesus did that. But until now, for Eliab, everything was just inflated stories, fishermen's tales. Now, tell me, if you were in Capernaum right now, in the middle of this crowd, would you believe it? Or would you think like Eliab? I want to know your opinion here in the comments. But there was something different about the atmosphere. The expectation was real. People left their tasks, interrupted negotiations, dropped what they were doing just to see him. Men who were repairing nets dropped their tools. Women left their homes hurriedly calling their children. Eliab was not a man of faith, but he was a businessman. And something inside him said that if a simple name was capable of moving an entire city, it was worth seeing what was happening. He hesitated for a moment. Would you follow or not? But before he could decide, his feet were already moving towards the crowd. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to witness something that not all your logic and business experience could explain. The movement in the village of Capernaum, it began to take a different direction. The flow of people, previously dispersed among the narrow streets and stone alleys, was now concentrated in a single point. The fruit, fabric, and spice stalls were left aside. The fishermen, who had previously been repairing their nets, abandoned their work to follow the crowd. The women, who had clay pots balanced on their heads, quickened their pace, holding the hands of their young children. Jesus was there. Eliab watched everything from afar. He didn't understand that irrational fascination. Since arriving in Capernaum, he had heard his name countless times. But what was so special about this man? His merchant instinct told him that where there was a crowd, there was a profit. But to his surprise, there were no coins being exchanged, nor goods being sold. People were not there to seek riches or close deals. They were there for another reason. Eliab's skepticism prevented him from approaching at first, but something inside him said he needed to see it. Not out of faith, but out of curiosity. He infiltrated the crowd, stopping next to a group of fishermen who were talking to each other. Everyone had their eyes fixed on a point ahead, and when Eliab finally saw it, something inside him stirred. At the center of everything, there was him. Jesus did not look like a king or a military leader. He wore no fine clothes, carried no gold, bore no signs of earthly power. His clothes were simple, his feet were dusty from the road, and yet he was impossible to ignore. There was something about his presence, something that made even the most hardened people bow their heads. It was not authority imposed by force, it was something different. Eliab frowned, trying to understand. Was that it? Was this simple man responsible for all this commotion? But before he could think any further, a commotion in the crowd caught his attention. The first patient was brought in. He was a blind man, an elderly man with time-marked skin, guided by the trembling hand of a younger relative. His eyes were dull, without shine. He walked hesitantly, feeling the ground with his feet, until he was placed before Jesus. Silence spread across the place. Everyone held their breath. Eliab crossed his arms, skeptical. He already knew what was coming next. He had seen many street healers on his travels, men who pretended to have divine powers, who worked with accomplices disguised as patients to deceive crowds. He already knew the trick. Jesus, however, did not make any spectacle. He didn't shout magic words. He didn't make grand gestures. He just approached the old man and touched his eyes gently. "Be restored." For a moment, nothing happened. Eliab sighed, ready to turn away, as expected. But then a murmur ran through the crowd. The old man blinked several times, confused. His breathing quickened. He raised his trembling hands and touched his face. The eyes, once opaque, now reflected the sunlight. He blinked once more, and then he saw it. The blind man's eyes were open. A cry of astonishment echoed through the village. Some fell to their knees, others put their hands to their mouths, unable to contain their tears. The old man staggered back, looking around as if he had never seen the world before. And in fact, he hadn't seen it. "I see," he shouted, his voice choked with emotion. "I see." The people exploded in exultation, shouting applause, praise to God. People cried, hugged each other, but Eliab remained motionless. He had seen what happened, but his mind refused to accept it. That wasn't possible. This was a trick. But what about you? Is there an explanation for everything Jesus does? Or are there miracles that defy all logic? If you've ever seen something that seemed impossible, tell me in the comments. He forced himself to believe it. But before he could organize his thoughts, another patient was brought in, this time a lame man. His legs were atrophied, the muscles too weak to support him. His friends carried him, placing him carefully before Jesus. The same silence took over the place. The eyes of the crowd were attentive. Jesus did not hesitate. He looked into the man's eyes and said something Eliab couldn't hear. And then, without any logical explanation, the man stood up. First, slowly, as if he didn't believe in his own body, then more firmly. And then he started walking. The crowd went into ecstasy. More screams, more tears, more praise. Eliab felt his heart race. What was happening there? He took a deep breath, trying to find an explanation, but for the first time he failed. Over the next few hours, miracle after miracle happened before his eyes. Possessed people fell to the ground, screaming, until Jesus simply ordered the spirits to leave, and they left. A woman with a large wound on her arm was touched, and the flesh closed instantly. A deaf boy had his ears restored and cried when he heard his mother's voice for the first time. With each new miracle, the shock grew in Eliab's heart, but he refused to accept it. Maybe it was a collective suggestion. Maybe these people weren't really sick. Perhaps. But something inside him was already beginning to waver, because he was watching. And when the last healing of the day took place, Jesus turned to the crowd. His gaze was calm, but firm. He didn't need to say anything. People knew they were facing something bigger. Eliab knew it too, but I didn't want to admit it. With a heavy heart and restless mind, he watched as the crowd began to disperse. The sun was already lower on the horizon, casting golden tones over the fishing village. People returned to their homes, taking with them stories that would be told for generations. But Jesus remained there, without rushing, without urgency. Eliab was about to leave, but something made him stop. A man appeared on the dirt trail, alone. He walked with difficulty, holding his own swollen abdomen. His skin was yellowish, his face was pale, his breathing was short and painful. The crowd had already left. There was no one there to see what would happen. No one except Jesus and Eliab. And without knowing it, the outsider was about to see the impossible happen. The sun already had began to descend on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the streets of Capernaum. The heat of the day still permeated the air, but the village was quieter now. The crowd had already left. Some women returned to their homes carrying jugs of water. The fishermen gathered their nets, and the last sellers folded their fabrics and extinguished the torches in their stalls. The buzz of the city, which had previously been filled with the exaltation of Jesus' miracles, now dissipated like smoke in the wind. But not everyone had left. Eliab was there, property. He watched from afar, still trying to process what he had witnessed. Hours before, he had seen the blind see, the lame walk, the sick healed. But his mind refused to accept it. He sought explanations, collective suggestion, role play, coincidence. He repeated this to himself, as if trying to convince himself. But something inside him was already beginning to waver. Jesus walked calmly along a dirt path, far from the center of the village. His face was calm, as if none of this was extraordinary, as if he hadn't just accomplished impossible feats. He did not seek recognition. He didn't ask for applause, just walked. Eliab, without realizing it, followed him at a distance. The silence was profound. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees and the sound of the sea lapping gently against the rocks. Time seemed to slow down. It was then that something interrupted that tranquility. A muffled sound, followed by faltering footsteps. Eliab stopped. His gaze returned to the curve of the trail. From there, a staggering man emerged. He walked with extreme difficulty, as if each step were a superhuman effort. His arms were shaking, his body seemed too fragile to stand. But what caught Eliab's attention most was his face. Pale, deep, dark circles. His skin had a sickly yellowish tone. And your abs. Eliab held his breath. His abdomen was grotesquely swollen. The skin was stretched to the maximum, as if something monstrous was growing inside him. It was a disturbing sight. The man staggered a few more steps and fell to his knees on the dusty floor. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. He didn't speak, he didn't ask for anything. But your eyes. His eyes begged for help. Eliab felt a chill. He knew that man. His name was Benias, a stonemason who worked in Capernaum. Or rather, he worked. Everyone knew he was doomed. His disease was incurable. The village healers had already given up. His family had already accepted his death. It was just a matter of time. Eliab clenched his fists. What was he doing there? His eyes turned to Jesus. He showed no surprise. He was not frightened by the man's cadaverous appearance. He did not retreat when he saw him fall before him. Just got closer. Benias was shaking. He wanted to speak, but his breathing was too weak. Jesus then knelt down beside him. Eliab caught his breath. The scene was strange. There was no crowd to applaud. There were no disciples watching. There was no one to tell this story. Just Jesus, Benias, and him. The stranger swallowed hard. He could leave at that moment. Turn your back and forget all that. But his feet were stuck to the floor. Jesus reached out his hand and touched Benias' shoulder. The touch was gentle but intense. The bricklayer groaned. His body shuddered, and an unexpected reaction began to happen. Eliab's eyes widened. Benaiah's abdomen began to contract violently. He arched his back, his mouth opened in a dry gasp. And then, the impossible happened. A guttural noise came from his throat. His entire body stiffened. He was about to vomit. Eliab took a step back, shocked. Benaiah shook violently, holding his stomach as if an invisible force was ripping it out from the inside out. His eyes widened, and then he vomited. But it wasn't something common. What came out of his mouth was neither bile nor blood. It was something solid, something dark, something horrible. Eliab couldn't believe what he saw. The tumor, the malignant tumor, the same one that had condemned Benaiah to death, was now there, on the dusty floor, pulsing as if it had a life of its own. Eliab instinctively backed away. This was not normal. That wasn't possible. But Benaiah was changing before his eyes. His abdomen, once grotesquely swollen, deflated as if there had never been anything there. His yellow skin was beginning to regain color. His eyes, once heavy and lifeless, shone again. He took a deep breath. For the first time in months, no pain. And then he stood up. Eliab felt a shiver run down his spine. This wasn't a trick. There was no crowd to be impressed by. Only he saw it happen. He saw with your own eyes. Benaiah looked at Jesus, his legs still shaking with emotion. His eyes were full of tears. He fell to his knees. "My God!" His voice was hoarse, overcome by crying. "I'm cured." Jesus just smiled. Eliab couldn't breathe properly. His heart was racing. There were no more explanations. The impossible was before him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to think. Now I ask you, how many times have you doubted and then realized you were facing something much bigger? Tell me here in the comments. Eliab still, he was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the dusty floor, where just a few seconds ago that grotesque tumor had been expelled from Benaiah's body. Time seemed to have stopped. The silence around was absolute. The wind blew lightly, stirring up some of the dust around, but nothing seemed real. What he had just seen defied all logic. Benaiah was still kneeling, his body shaking, his eyes wide, touching his own abdomen, as if he didn't believe it was possible. For months, he had carried the death sentence within him. Now her skin, once tight from swelling, was smooth again. His breathing, which had previously come in short, painful gasps, was now strong and deep. The cold sweat on his forehead had disappeared. But the most impressive thing was his eyes. They were full of tears, but not with despair, but with profound relief. Jesus remained by his side. There was no rush. There was no euphoria. He just watched him with a look of compassion, as if it were all natural. Eliab couldn't understand. This couldn't be real. His eyes dropped back to the floor, to what was left of the tumor. It was something real, something that shouldn't be there. Something he saw come out of Benaiah's own body. His heart raced. He was trying to find an explanation. He desperately tried to hold on to any logic he knew, but there was no logic there. The wind blew again, stronger. The smell of the sea invaded his nostrils, mixing with the dust of the road. Eliab didn't want to believe it, but he saw it, and for the first time in his life there was no denying it. Benaiah, still on his knees, looked up at Jesus. There was something in his gaze that was impossible to describe. Gratitude, reverence, fear. His voice was hoarse, hesitant. "Master, what did you do to me?" Jesus bent down slightly and placed his hand on his head. "You have been restored." It was a simple sentence, nothing more. But those words carried a weight that Eliab felt in every fiber of his body. Benaiah took a deep breath. His eyes filled with tears again, and he began to cry. But it wasn't a cry of pain. It was the cry of someone who had experienced the impossible. Eliab took a step back, then another. He needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. He felt like he was being suffocated, like an invisible pressure was on his shoulders. His heart was beating fast. This couldn't be real, but it was, because he saw. There was no crowd to create mass hysteria. There were no tricks, there was no acting. Just Jesus, just a dying man who was now healed. Benaiah slowly stood up. Eliab expected to see him staggering, expected to see a remnant of the disease. But no, he stood up firmly. His shoulders were straight, his breathing controlled. He was strong. He touched his own face, his own abdomen, still not believing what he felt. For months, he had lived with a death sentence. Now, he felt more alive than ever. His gaze turned to Jesus, and then he did something Eliab never imagined he would do. He fell face down on the floor, not just on your knees. He prostrated himself completely. Glory to God! His voice was choked with crying. Glory to the Most High! Jesus said nothing. I just watched him. Eliab felt a lump in his throat. Everything inside him screamed that he needed to get out of there, but he couldn't move. His eyes turned to Jesus, and it was at that moment that Jesus looked at him. It wasn't a casual look. It was direct, deep. Eliab felt a shiver run up his spine. He couldn't explain what was in that look, but he felt something inside him break. He who always laughed at faith was now faced with the impossible. He felt the weight of what he had witnessed. There was no explanation. He tried to deny it. He tried to fight what he saw. But what do you do when the truth is thrown in front of your eyes? The wind blew again, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to compose himself. But he knew he would never be the same again. Jesus turned to Benaiah again and reached out his hand to help him up. The man held the master's hand firmly, still crying, and stood. Eliab, still stunned, realized that Jesus did not look at Benaiah as a man who had been saved from a deadly disease. He looked at him as someone who always knew he would be restored, as someone who already saw the end before it all began. And that was what terrified Eliab the most, because he realized that Jesus already knew what would happen there, and maybe Jesus already knew what would happen to him too. The silence between the three remained for a few seconds. The world around seemed distant, but inside Eliab, something began to change. He saw, he couldn't deny it. The impossible happened before him, and for the first time, he didn't know who he was anymore. Eliab felt the weight of the silence around. It was suffocating. The wind blew gently, bringing with it the smell of the sea mixed with the dust of the road. The heat of the day still hung over the dry land, but within him a storm had brewed. Benaiah remained kneeling, sobbing with emotion. His fingers dug into the dust on the floor. His body shook with relief. The joy on his face contrasted with the internal chaos that took over Eliab. Jesus remained standing, observing the scene with a serene gaze. No rush, no urgency. Eliab could not take his eyes off him. He wanted to say something. I needed to say something, but the words didn't come. Everything he saw, everything he witnessed, was seared into his mind like fire carving stone. He could spend the rest of his life trying to erase that scene, but he would never be able to. Benaiah had not just been healed, he expelled his own illness, vomited the death sentence before his eyes. Eliab saw it. I couldn't deny it. And that was what terrified him the most. He felt a lump tighten in his throat. His body was there, but his mind was far away. I was trying to find an explanation. I tried to fit it into what I knew, but there was no logic, there was no trick, there was no illusion. And for the first time in his life, Eliab was without answers. His gaze met Jesus's again. And then Jesus smiled. A light, discreet smile, but it seemed to pierce his soul. Eliab felt a shiver run down his spine. What did that smile mean? It was as if Jesus knew exactly what was going on inside him. As if he saw your confusion, your resistance, your fear. As if he already knew his heart before he could even understand it. And that disconcerted him more than anything. Benaiah sobbed, murmuring prayers and praises. Emotion overflowed from him, but Eliab remained motionless. He didn't know what to do. His body wanted to move. His legs begged to take a step back, to move away, to pretend that none of this happened. But he couldn't move. It was as if he was trapped, paralyzed by the weight of the truth before him. The silence prolonged. Jesus said, "Nothing." He didn't try to explain. There was no need. Eliab knew that any explanation would be less than what he had witnessed. The wind blew again, slightly ruffling Jesus' clothes. Eliab's mouth opened. He wanted to ask, but his voice didn't come out. What could he ask? How did you do that? Who are you? Is this real? But all these questions seemed too small compared to what he felt, as if any answer was insufficient. He looked down for a moment. I needed to get away from that. Look, he needed to escape the truth that burned inside him. Benaiah remained kneeling, unable to stand up. It wasn't tiredness, it was reverence. He cried like a child who had just been saved from death, because that's exactly what happened. Eliab felt his chest tighten. There was something different in the air. He could feel it. It was as if he was on the edge of a precipice, as if he had spent his entire life building a castle of certainties. And now he was watching everything fall apart. Jesus stepped forward. Eliab held his breath, but Jesus did not look at him as an enemy. His look was that of someone who already knew everything, and that was the problem, because Eliab felt that Jesus knew exactly who he was. I knew his doubts, his disbelief. I knew he had never believed in anything other than gold and commerce, and yet Jesus did not reject him. Eliab wanted to retreat, but I couldn't, because deep down I knew that if I left now, I would never forget that moment. He could. Try to erase it from his memory. I could try to deny it, run away, argue. But in the silence of that dusty trail, the truth was already inside him, and that tormented him more than anything else. Benaiah sobbed again, her shoulders shaking, his fingers still dug into the earth. I should be dead, he murmured without looking up. I was doomed. His voice broke. But the Lord brought me back. Eliab closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't pretend he didn't see it. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if everything he believed up until that moment was a lie. Because if that man called Jesus was capable of doing that, then who was he really? Eliab felt the weight of each step as I walked back to town. The sun was already setting on the horizon, casting orange and gold tones over the stone streets. The heat of the day was beginning to give way to a cooler breeze, but he felt no relief. His mind was in a whirlwind. He needed to get out of there. I didn't want to look at Jesus anymore. I didn't want to look at Benaiah anymore. What had happened on that dusty trail defied everything he believed. He quickened his pace, ignoring the noise of the cicadas around him. He needed to get away. Jesus was still standing next to Benaiah, but Eliab did not look back. Something inside him told him that if he looked, he might never be able to look away again. His heart was pounding, as if trying to keep up with the confusion inside him. Each thought ran over the other. This doesn't make sense. This is not possible. But he saw it. And now, what would you do with this truth? He walked faster. The loose stones of the trail crunched beneath her sandals, and sweat ran down her forehead, even in the cool afternoon wind. The way back seemed infinitely longer. Before, when he came here, he was just a merchant watching a preacher. Now he was a man trying to escape what he saw. But how to escape the impossible? He passed a mud house where a woman was sweeping the floor with a bundle of straw. She had no idea what had just happened nearby. Across the street, a group of children were playing, kicking a small piece of crumpled cloth like a ball. None of them knew that a condemned man had been healed. Life in Capernaum continued, but inside Eliab, everything was different. He entered the market. The noise returned. Vendors shouted their deals of the day. Fresh fish, Arabian spices, pure wool from Judea, the sound of commerce, once so familiar to him, now seemed distant. His eyes passed over each stall, each animated face of a merchant trying to negotiate a good price. Before, this was your world. Now, it seemed so small. He clenched his fists. Why were you feeling this way? He hadn't asked to see this. I didn't want to see that, but you saw. And now nothing else seemed to have the same importance. A woman passed by his side, commenting on the miracles Jesus had performed that afternoon. Eliab shuddered. Before, he would have laughed. They would have been just stories to him. But now, he couldn't laugh, because he was part of one of those stories. But nobody knew that. No one knew what he saw, what only he saw. The tumor, Benaiah's body transforming before his eyes. The truth was within him, but he couldn't tell anyone, because he himself still didn't know if he believed it. Eliab stopped in the middle of the market. People passed by him as if he wasn't there. He felt his hands shake. This cannot be happening. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. But the air seemed thicker, the smell of fish, of baked bread, of spices. Everything that was once so common now seemed distant. Nothing was the same anymore. His heart was pounding. He ran his hand over his face, trying to get the weight off his chest. But I couldn't, because the truth was already there, and he didn't know what to do with her. The noise of the market was becoming muffled. He looked around, feeling like a foreigner in his own life. What would he do now? He could not return to Tyre and Sidon as if nothing had happened. But he also couldn't just accept what he saw, because if he accepted, everything he believed in would fall apart. He felt anger rising within him. Why did Jesus do this? Why did you put him in that position? Before he was sure of everything. Now I wasn't sure of anything. Eliab closed his eyes for a moment, but as soon as he did that, the image came again, suddenly vomiting or tumor, the look of Jesus. His smile, he knew. Jesus knew this would happen. I knew Eliab would see, and he knew it would leave him like this. He clenched his teeth. That's not fair. He didn't ask to see a miracle. I didn't want to see a miracle, but he was chosen to see. And now, what would he do? Eliab opened his eyes and saw his own reflection in a bronze jar hanging in a tent. His eyes were different. That was no longer the expression of the man who entered that market hours before. He was no longer the same. And it was his biggest fight. Eliab was still standing in the middle of the market, as if the world around him was spinning faster than he could keep up. The traders' shouts echoed, children laughed, running between the stalls. The strong smell of fish and spices filled the air. Everything was as before, but inside him, everything had changed. His breathing was still uneven, his heart was beating fast. He tried to hold on to any semblance of normalcy, but his whole life now seemed small, insignificant. He felt like he was between two worlds, the man he was before seeing that miracle, and the man he was about to become. Eliab ran his hand over his face. I needed to get out of there. The people around laughed, talked, discussed prices, followed their routines without even imagining that something impossible had happened that day. But he knew. And now, what would you do with it? He tried to convince himself that he could just leave, forget everything, return to Tyre and Sidon, continue your business, your comfortable life, your profitable trade. But he couldn't take a single step in that direction, because deep down, he knew the truth. If he left now, he would spend the rest of his life tormented by what he saw. Doubt would grow inside him like a shadow, haunting his days, stealing his nights. Eliab felt a sudden anger. Why did this happen to him? He was not a follower of this Jesus. He didn't look for him. He didn't ask for answers. But even so, he was chosen to see it. And now, he took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. But there was only one possible conclusion. He needed to understand who this Jesus was. I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't pretend that didn't happen. If Jesus was just a preacher, how did he do that? If he was just one man, how could he defy the laws of nature itself? Eliab closed his eyes for a moment. The memories came back strong. The look of Jesus, your smile. It was as if he already knew what was happening inside him. As if I already knew the decision he would make, he opened his eyes again with a thought that had never crossed his mind before. What if everything they said about Jesus was true? A shiver ran through his body. This was a possibility he had never considered. For him, religion had always been just a form of control, a way of giving people hope. He always lived by commerce, from what I could count, measure, sell. But now, there was something bigger before him, something that could not be told. It couldn't be measured. It couldn't be sold. Eliab felt a tightness in his chest. All his life, he believed that the only truth was gold. But now, he didn't know what to believe anymore. He looked around, as if searching for an answer in the faces of the strangers who passed by him, but no one there could answer, because the answer was within him. Eliab swallowed. What would you do now? If he stayed, he would have to face the truth. If he left, he would spend the rest of his life running away. From her, the wind blew strong at that moment. He took with him the smell of the sea. Eliab felt a chill down his spine. Because I knew what his decision was. He was no longer just a merchant looking for profits. Now, he was a man searching for answers. And there was only one place he could find them. Eliab turned slowly, and he started walking back to where it all started, back to where Jesus was. How many of us have been through this? How many have tried to run away from the truth only to realize it was always there? If this story reminded you of something, comment below, I've seen the truth. I want to know how many of you have felt this. Eliab still held Jesus' hand. His eyes were teary, his breathing was heavy. He felt the warmth of that touch. It was real, and at the same time, it was impossible, because all his life he resisted the truth. He ridiculed her. He despised those who believed. He laughed at those who had faith. But now, he knelt before the one he always denied. He felt solid ground beneath his knees, but inside him, everything was falling apart. Because now, he knew, what was once just a story to him was now his own story. Eliab closed his eyes, feeling the breeze touch his face. That dusty trail changed his life forever. But now, this story comes to you. How many times do we reject what we cannot understand? How many times do we ask for a sign? And when it happens, we pretend we didn't see it. How many times does God show us the impossible? And yet we look for another explanation. Eliab saw a miracle before his own eyes, and I didn't know what to do with the truth. But what about you? If you were in his place, watching the impossible happen before you, how would you react? What would you do if there was no more denying it? What would you do if the truth was in front of you, waiting for your answer? Because perhaps this isn't just Eliab's story. Maybe this is your story. Maybe, in some way, you too have spent your life running, away from what was always there. Maybe you saw miracles but called them coincidences. Maybe you've already felt God speak to you, but you ignored it. Maybe I waited for a perfect moment to believe. But what if that moment is now? Eliab returned to the trail, and on that path he found the truth. Now, the question that remains is, what will be your decision? Stories like this are not told anywhere, but here, in Unknown Stories of Jesus, each story has the power to transform your view of faith. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Eliab's place, how would you react to seeing a miracle like this? Comment here below. I want to know your opinion. What would you do? Would you run away or accept the truth? And I'm sure this story touched your heart and you want to discover more hidden miracles of Jesus. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because this is the only place where these stories are told as they should be. Now, click on the next video, because there's another secret miracle that few know about, and it could change everything you've ever heard about Jesus. The hidden stories of Jesus.